I don't want to do too many takes for this as it's my first impressions. What you'll see in the background is something for Cyberpunk 2077 downloading, validating files because I was getting a crash on startup, or a flatline on startup as they like to put it. At first I assumed it was because I changed two files, those files being a modification to the key bindings, which don't exist. Dodging is double tapping, which is frustrating when accidentally dodging places, but it's unchangeable. And then there's also, and then now you can bind that to a single key binding, but I changed two files, which are kilobytes in size. I don't know why there's a 7 gigabytes file validation required. I don't understand that. Which the irony is that a couple days after playing the game, I download some mods, for which mods aren't supported at launch, claimed by CD Projekt Red. And the issue is that you have companies that don't have their stuff together, they don't have their game together, like Bethesda, for example. What makes it okay is that it has lots of mod support, and 2077 has none. So the modders can't fix their issues, one being the lack of the ability to rebind dodging, which is double tap.
Another thing about modding is that even if there's elements of a game that are missing, or promises that weren't made, or this and that could make the game an overall better experience, the modding that is afforded to Skyrim, despite base Skyrim being a subpar game, and at least in terms of like some of its systems like melee combat, it doesn't matter because people can add anything they want to the game. So even a subpar Skyrim, which Skyrim does have many great open world features that Cyberpunk doesn't, base game alone, like people are adding online multiplayer to Skyrim. People have created 20-hour quest lines for Skyrim, fully voice acted. People have completely revamped the combat system, adding features and systems in the game that weren't present. Because Skyrim is moddable, it compensates for the developer incompetency 30-fold. Skyrim will be a much better game than many games because of its modding capabilities, and why I and many people will still play Skyrim to this day. Cyberpunk, on the other hand, is missing a lot of features. That would make the game much better and more playable. But it doesn't have modding support. And in fact, I'm waiting for some mods to get released to make the game more playable. Ironically enough, there are some games like Dragon's Dogma, for example, that don't really have a strong modding scene. It only requires 1 or 2 mods to be playable. It's because its combat system, its character creation. Dragon's Dogma does so many things right from the start to make it a good game. So it doesn't need that many mods. Even then, it still has like some game-breaking balance issues. Not unlike Cyberpunk, that modders have been able to fix it. Not so much with Cyberpunk though, at least not yet.
My first impressions of the game are basically, first of all, I have to give some backstory because a lot of people will defend this game saying that it was overhyped, so no one had proper expectations. I had a little cash to throw around, so I had not much to look forward to, so I said I might as well pre-order this game and get some bonuses because I'm going to buy it anyway. CD Projekt Red has a good track history. I almost never buy games at launch. In fact, the only game I can think of that I ever bought at launch was Devil May Cry 5, which was good, which was decent. It had its issues, but it was pretty decent. I enjoyed it. This game, I said, well, it should at least be good. The company has a good track record and everything. And it's okay. Ultimately, I have to say it's an okay game. It doesn't really do anything too groundbreaking. It has hacking, and I would say one of the most innovative things is the integrated melee combat. There aren't too many games where there's blocking with a melee weapon like a sword, and there are multiple dedicated melee weapons such as swords and batons, etc., where one can block or parry or slash or heavy slash. Normally when first person shooters have melee weapons are surprisingly underdeveloped, whether it be a one-hit kill knife or just a slash, one click for a slash. Occasionally, there'll be a heavy attack with a melee weapon, but usually there's no effort or development put into melee weapons. I have to give Cyberpunk that much, let alone a block feature. Now, obviously, games like Shadowrun have done it a little bit better. That said, a huge missed opportunity that it isn't possible to block bullets with a katana, which is very Cyberpunk-esque. Oh, I forgot, there's also a dodge feature, which is good. But unfortunately, though, Cyberpunk has the issue that a lot of games tend to have when it comes to first-person perspective. And I think that has to deal with the cone of vision, where in order to use melee, one has to get close up. However, in close quarters, slight movement can completely change the visibility of the enemy. So it can be difficult to figure out exactly what's going on, especially when fighting multiple enemies and being in one enemy's face with a melee weapon. So third person in this context, in the context of melee, provides many advantages, which I do want to make another video for third person, like an actually edited and scripted video, because this is unscripted. But yeah, I do have to applaud them for actually delving into melee a little bit. It could be a little bit more mechanically complex, as this is the future and people have augments installed into their brains and arms and bodies. I can easily see a mod that could allow one to block bullets with the sword, even if it's for a short while. Outside of applauding Cyberpunk for that, when it comes to innovation in terms of first-person shooters that feature melee combat, there is also hacking, which is Watch Dogs has it. Hacking mostly cameras, sometimes the opponent, distractions, nothing to write home about too much. And then there's also the upgrade system and skill tree system, which allow for mostly buffs, which is quite disappointing. There's several different skill trees. There's about 5, and then from each of those skill trees there's like subcategories. For example, body or reflexes being one of the 5. You go into reflexes, and then from reflexes you can choose sword or melee, handgun, and assault rifle to upgrade those. And then each different one, like cool, has cold-blooded stealth. There's the level points, and then there's the perk point. A lot of these perks go into passive upgrades like more damage or faster speed, which, while it's very RPG-esque, it feels underwhelming that there are very few new techniques one can learn from this. Now, I haven't completed the game, as this is more of a first impressions, so I don't want to speak too much about what can and can't happen. Like, I know there is a double jump ability, which can be installed through actual doctors, where one has to go there and get things installed into one's body, get different parts and cybernetics. I don't know if these cybernetics are viewable, which is, another interesting thing. Like, for example, if one wanted to replace their hands with machines, but I don't want to get too much into that, as again, this is more of a first impression. That said, when it comes to the gunplay, I must say that it's mostly standard fare. There isn't much to write home about it. You have guns. I applaud them for having guns where they have tracking ammunition, but in a cyberpunk future, I always imagine that the meta of combat would have changed. So if everyone's walking around with exoskeletons and bionic arms and limbs and everything, people wouldn't just be fighting by shooting each other with guns, with more or less normal guns, aside from the ones that have bullets that trace the opponent. Like, I would imagine there would be more to the combat. There would be a different meta. Take, for example, Rainbow Six Siege, where Rainbow Six Siege doesn't play like most games because one can shoot through the wall. And it is true that in Cyberpunk one can shoot through the walls, but only with certain sniper rifles. But each gun in Rainbow Six has penetration power, and the environment is mostly destructible. The meta sort of revolves around shooting holes in the walls and then sniping someone from the holes, and then blowing up doors with explosives, or setting up traps, or using drones to scout out the area. Hacking cameras is entirely possible in that game as well, and then using those cameras to see. But the thing is, Rainbow Six Siege, in a sense, is more futuristic than Cyberpunk, which should not be the case. The meta of the combat in Rainbow Six Siege has evolved well beyond something like Call of Duty or Counter-Strike Go or any other of the hundreds of multiplayer first-person shooters or single player first person shooters out there. The meta has changed. The game doesn't play like other shooters. Well, it can to an extent. There's also lack of mobility. There's going prone. And I'm going to talk about the mobility and things like prone in Cyberpunk for a second, but I bring this up to say that this game doesn't do very much that's groundbreaking. In other words, one can say that it functions more or less like most other shooters. It's just another shooter when it comes to gameplay, outside of the investment into melee combat. Outside of that, talking about things like prone, there's a cover system, but I guess one thing is that the enemy can hack the player, but so far I've only gotten burned. I've only taken damage from being hacked by the enemy, but it doesn't really feel like a fully immersive branch of the combat system. It doesn't feel like it contributes. It feels like it's just one special ability that does damage to the player while the player is behind cover. And speaking of cover, I thought that the cover mechanics would be a little bit more refined. Peeking over cover, unlike in Rainbow Six where one has buttons to lean in a certain direction, the leaning is done automatically, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. And then, of course, being in first-person mode while behind cover, it's very difficult to tell if one's body parts are behind cover. If I'm not mistaken, there are games that have actually solved this issue by having a sort of snap-to-cover feature while showing the player in third person when they're specifically behind cover. I believe some games have it. But anyway, I do get poked when I believe I'm behind cover, and as this is an open world game where things like cover is limited depending on the particular environment one finds himself in during a firefight, it can be irritating to try and find cover only to find that somebody's shooting your toe. And speaking about somebody, in other words, the AI is actually not very good either. I've seen countless times the enemy AI making very questionable decisions, as well as my own teammate, Jackie, not hiding behind cover or going out in the open, or I mean, it's 2077. Isn't there better AI out there? I mean, hasn't AI been figured out? People talk about this game being overhyped, but they couldn't figure out AI. I don't understand. This game has been in development for 8 years, and they couldn't figure out AI. Things like this kind of perturb me. So the gameplay it's okay. I do really appreciate the melee integration. I do utilize distractions, but distractions aren't really a new thing. Taking control of cameras isn't a new thing. We have Watch Dogs, we have Rainbow Six Siege, and I'm not even a first-person shooter type person. There's other features like doing damage to the opponent, hacking the opponent. I mean, I imagine that... Oh, I'm not even going to finish that thought. I just remembered one of the high points of gameplay is light spoilers for side missions. Is when I was tasked to find someone whose implants had more or less taken over their body, and the police were going to exterminate them. So I found that person. I found the officer. And the fight was really interesting. I would have to say it's one of my high points of the game, where the person, I don't think she ever used a gun on me. I think she just used literally her fists. You'd go in to shoot her, but she would start dashing side to side, not unlike the boss from Metal Gear Solid 3. The only difference is she has this type of unique effect. It's like an anime effect where she becomes a blur, and as she's dashing side to side, she's actually creating these sort of like blurred after images, where they're not an after image of her body. They're sort of like streaks where she's moving so fast it's very difficult to hit her. And then even if you do hit her, it doesn't do a terrible amount of damage with the gun. So when she goes in to hit you, your options are to block or to dodge. And I found myself having to rely on melee in order to block her attacks and counterattack, which it was a very refreshing experience. I can't say I've had that type of experience in many other games, because most first-person shooter developers are very bad at developing melee encounters. So in an encounter like this, where the opponent has tools to deal with range gameplay, that being high-speed movement and actually disappearing from the screen at regular intervals, they actually did heavy attacks against the player, which can be blocked with a melee weapon. That said, even playing on very hard, it wasn't the most difficult, but it did have me on the edge of my seat. It was relatively difficult, fairly difficult. So that was actually one of the high points and unique interactions I had in the game.
So, in relation to melee gameplay, I do have to say that it's a problem with combat in general, but also melee. The fact that the melee fighting, while I'm glad it's implemented, does feel quite floaty. I do think it has to do with the fact that one can move and attack at the same time. I think that inherently makes just about any melee floaty. Even in games like Skyrim, when one's constantly moving in a circle while swinging at the same time, um, doing that in an actual fight with bladed weapons, or even any kind of weapons, moving side to side and doing attacks makes one ungrounded when they're attacking. Um, there can be some movement, but that's beside the point. Anyway, it feels floaty. It's hard to tell when I'm getting hit or when I'm actually blocking the attack, as there's a grunt noise, for a very light grunt noise when one gets hit and when one blocks an attack. In combat situations, melee and non-melee, I do find myself not knowing what my health is, as due to the chaotic nature of being in an open world with first person only mode, having to constantly look at the top right map to see where my enemies are, and then having to look at the top left to see my HP, and then having to look at my enemies to try and not get hit. It it can all be a huge cluster, of absolute nonsense. So the melee attacks, again, they feel floaty. Uh, Swinging doesn't feel like it has a lot of weight or gravity to it. I don't really know when my opponent dies, so I end up just swinging and swinging even after they're dead. Uh, and then outside of that, yeah, it's the other part of it is that the whole crouching function is kind of tough for me. Um, there's some slight delay when crouching, so I end up crouching and standing up constantly. I can't see myself crouching because it's first person, but there's an icon in the bottom right, so quickly one can find a problem between glancing at the top left, the top right, and the bottom right all at the same time while also looking at the screen. And then also not knowing if one is behind cover or not when one is getting shot at. So all in all, it's pretty difficult. Um, Combat really needs to get tightened up some more.
Had in the game. Outside of that, we can move on to the story. Now, I largely don't. There's lots of things that flew over my head as far as the story is concerned. That could be my fault. But ultimately, I can't say I really feel as though I own the character as much as I would in, say, Skyrim or even Mass Effect, where the things I say and the things I can choose to say and the things that my character says seem to be, it's like the character's personality seems to outshine my dialogue option to a point where it feels that I don't have that much agency over the character. Now, Cyberpunk, that can or can't be a problem for some people, but Cyberpunk is supposed to be a character-driven, story-driven. Again, one creates their character from the T. Unfortunately, they won't be able to see the character, at least in my case, who they spent at least 2 hours customizing, very much at all. But again, that's a topic for another video. A huge disappointment for me, to say the least. What I did enjoy about the story is that sometimes there's multiple options to completing a mission, be it side mission or main mission, whereas one might be able to see in my screen, one can actually do other things, do optional things before starting the main mission that influence the possibilities of the mission. So there was one mission I had, a side mission, where the options were to neutralize an enemy. But instead of killing the person, I actually knocked them out and I dragged their body all the way back to the car. And that created a completely different scenario than it would have had I just killed the person. I really appreciate things like that. I really appreciate. So that, which is sort of unique, and the melee gameplay are two of the outstanding features in this game. Outside of that, I can't think of too much that really catches my attention. Now, I've had greater dialogue options with Mass Effect, where one's actions have huge ramifications for not only the first game, but or the game that one's playing, whether it be the first or the second, but subsequent game, you know. And outside of that, the game looks, I don't even want to say that the game looks good. Like, it looks okay. It could be a settings issue, but it looks like, I almost want to say that Devil May Cry 5 looks just as good, if not better. It could be a settings issue with me. I have a GTX 2060 Super. Let me pull up diag.exe real quick, because I don't like have my my CPU memorized. I have a I have 8 gigabytes display memory, 16 gigabytes RAM. I have a Intel Core i7 9700 CPU. It 3 gigahertz per CPU at 8 CPUs. My computer's pretty decent. I run it at max settings, everything ultra. I run it at not HDR, but RTX on, and it looks okay. It looks okay. I think it could be the film grain or something that's enabled in the settings, but I'm not completely blown away by the game in terms of visuals either. Now, to add on to the story is the environment. When I compare this game to The Witcher, I think about how, and the funny thing is, it said that one's appearance will affect how players treat the player character. And what's interesting is that in The Witcher 1, Witcher 2, I haven't played Witcher 3 yet, but I'm going to, is that in any given setting, the NPCs will comment about the Witcher's appearance. They'll say, oh, hey, look, it's a Witcher. Hey, don't take any of our kids away. Or, man, the Witcher's eyes look kind of creepy. Oh, I bet you're stealing all the girls. They'll have some type of comment to say about the Witcher. Or they'll also have a comment to say about what's happening in the given story, because there's multiple stages of the story and multiple chapters, and depending on what happened, the NPCs will comment on that. But the thing is, in Cyberpunk 2077, most NPCs are inconsequential. They don't mean anything. They don't comment on anything. They don't have anything to say about anything. They're just walking to and fro. There's a huge quantity of NPCs that's been increased, but ultimately the amount of them don't really mean much. But I guess that's a consequence of having a huge open world. And I think one of the things that a lot of open worlds get criticized for is having a lot of space but not much to do in that space. Whereas games like Breath of the Wild get lauded for having a lot of space, yet there's a Korok seed or a temple around every corner, or some type of secret around every corner, despite being so big. And while there are some, police situations or investigations or mobs here and there, the only thing to really find is junk and, different trash to sell to the vendors. And speaking of vendors, some are missing. People talk about how there's no way to change the hairstyle in game, and what we see is a walk back from The Witcher yet again. In The Witcher, there's barbers where one can go to change their hairstyle, even as early as the first Witcher. Yet we have this game that took 8 years of development, and we have a feature that is missing from this game that was in all of the other games. And then we have the weird mirror thing, which again, I don't want to get too much into the lack of third person, which is again for a completely different video. But it seems like this game overall has very little to offer in contrast to other games. Like, if one were to think, what does this game give me over other shooter, right? And then I'm thinking about Splatoon and Splatoon 2, how those games I shouldn't say revolutionized, because the combat of Splatoon is its own thing. Nintendo with Splatoon, they created. I'm starting to sound like a Nintendo fanboy now. But whatever, I guess. Like they yeah, I'm starting to sound like Blanc from Hyperdimension Neptunia. You know, and it's like, not sound like her, but represent her. Yeah, I've been like actually forgetting lots of other things. Like there's this other game, this other Cyberpunk-esque game, and it's like I remember the meme. The meme is I didn't ask for this. You know, I didn't ask for this game. I remember playing that game and being more impressed with the stealth and the potential story options and ramifications of one's choices. And I believe they even had third-person finishing moves and the stealth being more complex. This game also does have stealth. Sneaking up to someone and knocking them unconscious. But then it's like even the stealth is relatively subpar, as sure, one can get upgrades where they can walk more quietly or grab the body as they knock them out, but Metal Gear is a better stealth game. And if I'm not mistaken, the I didn't ask for this game had better stealth as well, although it's been years since I've played that game. Segueing again, let's talk about the codex, or the readable codex. There's another game that had codex. It's called Dark Souls. Perhaps some of you are familiar, or as a certain creator might call it, Dark Sounds. In that game, they had a type of codex system where one would pick up a weapon or a piece of armor or an item, and there would be flavor text regarding that item. What this game has is paragraphs of text upon each codec that's picked up. Some of these codecs will be in story mission, or many of them will be, and in several cases there will be codecs several feet away from the other one. So going on a story mission, trying to pick up everything, one might pick up these codecs, and it's like, I bet right now I have 50 codecs easily, and it's like, I read a few of them because I'm that type of person who know a lot about the game and the story. But the problem is each of them are several paragraphs in length, and there's so many of them. And many of them are actually very relevant to the particular portion of the story and the game that the player is at. If one reads it later, they will miss the context, because the codec explains the context of the area and the portion of the story that one's at many of the time. But the problem is they're so lengthy and they're so wordy, and it's just not that I don't feel too compelled to read them as much as I did. I still want to read them, but when I think of a game like Mass Effect or Dark Souls, I was very interested in the world and the lore, especially Mass Effect. I mean, both of them really, but you're trying to piece together a story that's happening, at least in Dark Souls. In Mass Effect, there's all of this technology and there's all of these different races, and it explains the technology in excruciating scientific detail, and it explains this and it explains that, and they're all voice acted in Mass Effect, at least 1 and 2. But this game, I can't really find myself that interested in everything to that extent. They would have probably done better to incorporate a lot of these codecs into the story in a meaningful way, or the game, as opposed to just slapping the player with several paragraphs of text every so often. I feel like it doesn't really lend to the game, like Mass Effect, for example. Again, I was very interested and intrigued into the lore of that game. Everything was very fascinating. But this one, it's Cyberpunk. There's the corporations. Of course, they have the starting classes, the nomads. I read about the nomads, which was interesting. And in the opening, the police officer asks if you've heard of him. And I thought it would have been really interesting if the player actually read some codec or something, which could be the case, and I missed it. And because of reading that, the player is actually familiar with the officer. There's just too much to read. So what else do I have to say about the game? Overall, I'd have to say, unless I remember anything while I'm doing the overall, the game it adds little to what already exists. It doesn't do much that's groundbreaking. In fact, it's missing a lot of features that other games do have. Features that are important to many people, like third person, in addition to first person. Ultimately, the game it's very okay. It's decent. I can think of games where, like Far Cry or something, where I would shoot the gun and it really felt like I was shooting a gun. Far Cry 3 or something. This one, it's good, but well, it's still in my memory. I'm gonna talk about the meta again. Like Crisis. Crisis had different modes that allowed one to tackle combat situations in different ways, such as stealth, power, shield, etc. If I'm not mistaken, there was like a Call of Duty futuristic game where one can like rip doors off of walls or cars or something and use them as shield. And it's like, this game doesn't really have, and I've mentioned this earlier, but if this game wants to be a good game, and obviously the game doesn't have any consciousness, but it is Cyberpunk, so maybe there's AI or something, but it has to do a standard amount of things well, and then it has to innovate in some way. Innovate at least in the terms of its setting. A game that takes place in 2077 shouldn't play like any other shooter for the most part, with some light hacking elements. Again, I'm jumping back into an older topic of the meta, but look at Mass Effect 1 and even 2. They have futuristic weapons that do very unique things. Some of them, they are weapons that work in the future. Outside of that, they have like with the powers, I completely forgot what they're called, the powers that they use, and in one, in order to survive, and I think I also played on very hard, one had to use their troops effectively and use their powers effectively and their build effectively in order to get through. And this game doesn't have much of a unique meta of its own, outside of the melee combat. And everything it does do in its gameplay has been done better in other games. And it makes the gameplay, at least, it makes it feel very mediocre. Full disclosure, I play melee and handgun for the most part, but occasionally I do like firing off a couple of rounds with the assault rifle or sniper if the enemy's far back. There's another game I was thinking about that had its own type of similar meta, but it's just, this game just doesn't do enough to set itself apart from other games, and everything that it does do, the sum of its parts, the stealth gameplay it's okay, it's not Metal Gear, but it's okay. It's just, you sneak up on somebody, you knock them down or whatever, you knock them out, you kill them, par for the course for the most part. And there's the gunplay, which, so far at least, most of the guns are just guns outside of the auto-aiming feature, or not auto-aiming, but the bullet tracking feature with some guns. And then there's the story, which is sort of interesting, sort of. I'm not too invested in the story so far. You just doing some shady stuff. A lot of people are saying who've beaten the game that the starting classes don't change much of the story. I would imagine that the starting class should really affect a lot of options that the player character chooses to take. Not the player, but the player character. And how they choose to approach missions. As far as approaching missions, I was pleasantly surprised when I chose to complete a mission in a certain way, and it ended up blowing up in my face because I decided to do something. And no spoilers. This has gotten a little bit rambly, but to reiterate, probably for the 5th time, this game, if I had to give it a score, if I remember anything, I'll probably just start rambling again. If I had to give it a score, oh, time to ramble. So I've noticed that some of the characters, I don't remember what game it was, but there's games that they have certain functions, like certain quality of life things, or certain polishes that make them really good. Like for The Witcher, I've always liked how The Witcher 3, and even in mini games, one can walk around in some multiplayer games and they'll see characters doing something. And what they'll be doing is they'll be switching weapons. Because simple things like the sheathing and unsheathing animations for games can be very satisfying. Like, I'll find myself in The Witcher 2 just taking out one sword and putting the other sword back because it's such a satisfying interaction of the character. So I always really like to have visible weapons on the character, and as such, a modder made such a mod for Skyrim that people download because people like that stuff. I like that stuff. I would love for there to be visible weapons on the body, and one can even look at the holster and draw the weapon and, I don't know, spin it around or something. Or they have a sword in a sheath and they draw the sword from the sheath, and then they sheath it back when they're done with it. Just simple things like that would make it really cool. It's like there's lots of small things like that don't really exist, but some of the small things that they do put emphasis on, and I guess this is one of the strengths of the game, is the attention to detail. From every jacket to every, like, I was looking at one of the jackets that I'll probably only see a couple of times because I'll very rarely see the jacket on my character's body, but it has like a padding and there's some slight rips in it. Or the environment with desks and clutter and everything that's everywhere. They spend a lot of time and effort in detail and budget into making these very small mesh related, and for those of you who don't know, mesh is like the term for 3D models. Mesh related, just mesh and texture related improvements and clutter and items and small details on buildings or the ground or clothing or motorcycles or cars. And it seems like that's the true strong point of this game, is the attention to detail in the environment, whether the environment looks good or not because of the weird filters or artistic choice or whatever. They did put a lot of detail into clutter. And I guess that's the biggest strong point of this game that makes it stand out from other games is the weird attention to detail it comes to when it comes to that. I wish they would have, put some of that detail into other things. Like there's another game that came out recently that's called Ghost Runner, which is also a Cyberpunk related game, that while it also has melee, it's also possible to wall run and block bullets with the blade, and there's other features that I haven't gotten into, and I'm not even going to talk about how the swords in that game look better than this one. But those are just a couple of things that they could have given some thought to, is how the player will traverse different locations on foot. I don't want to say platforming because that could kind of break the in-game world, but platforming is a sort of a part of the game already. But all in all, this game doesn't do anything outside of clutter for the most part well enough to differentiate itself in a good enough way from its peers. The cybernetics don't make much of an impact. I mean, again, I know there's like the buffs, the stat buffs, the stat increases that exist in other games without cybernetics, but there just isn't enough. Like, take Devil May Cry 5, for example, where Nero has a mechanical arm, and Nero can swap out his mechanical arm at any time with another mechanical arm that does something different. Now, I know there are different like mantis blades, and there might be something like that, but it's just what I'm trying to say is that the game doesn't utilize its setting enough to make the game unique enough, to make it good enough, to give it some type of quality that other games don't have. Again, Rainbow Six Siege utilizes lots of futuristic technology that completely impact each character. For the most part, changes how the game will be played for the other side. You have hackers, and you have drones, and you have people that have stealth, and you have people that can fry one's technology, like when, and this is another small detail thing, when somebody's like hacking your phone, so your phone goes off and it reveals your location, because you have to listen for footsteps to figure out where the person is coming from. And the player, or at least the player character, will actually take out their phone and start tapping at it to try and like turn it off. And I can just imagine that if in Cyberpunk, when someone receives it, when the player character receives a call, one can actually like take out their phone, in like it's an in-game animation where the phone gets taken off and they press a button or something, and then they put it to their head to talk to someone. I mean, maybe the phone's built into their head or something anyway, but it's like just a small detail like that will go a long way, I believe. And it's just this game. So the score, I would probably give it maybe a 6 to 7. It's a competent game, ignoring bugs and the like. I've gotten a few bugs. I've gotten several bugs actually, but that it's whatever. It's competent in the sense that it's an open world shooter with a couple of mechanics. Some of them are like say there's different tiers of mechanics, right? Where the higher the tier, the more impact it has on the game. Like, for example, melee and hacking. Those impact it more, but most games, there are games that have hacking or distractions. Even in Metal Gear, one can throw a pebble, which can be used anywhere, instead of just throw a pebble or something, or lay down a magazine. And these things can be used anywhere for distractions, as opposed to distractions being limited to hacking certain terminals, which makes it more restrictive ultimately. And then there's the camera thing, which isn't really that big of a deal. There's different quick hacks. Again, I don't know all of them, but I think in order to fix it, this is going to be a long ramble. This is an hour ramble. Holy. Anyway, I can't believe I've been rambling for like 50 minutes. But ultimately, I would have to say that the game's biggest flaw is that it's an okay game. I wouldn't necessarily say it's worth the $60. It doesn't ask much from the player by means of difficulty, and even on very hard mode, it's like the difficulty is sort of like predicated on the engagement area, and then one can just run away from just about any firefight. Yeah, I guess I haven't touched on the difficulty. One can run away from just about any firefight, and just run and search out cover. Or I mean, imagine if someone had a lot of strength and they could just like just put their hand inside the car and turn it on its side for more cover. Imagine. Imagine, right? Cyberpunk isn't that type of game where it tries to innovate based on its setting. And that's the strength of most games, where they use their setting and create a series of gameplay systems based on that setting, or even utilize the story. And once again, the story itself, I can't say I'm that impressed. In fact, I'm a little bit lost on it, a little bit. I get the gist of it, but it's just... also, to be fair, I did end up accidentally skipping one of the opening cutscenes by pressing escape because I thought there would be a pause. Like, you know what? Another good game to compare this game to is Final Fantasy 13. Lots of people dislike Final Fantasy 13 for having a game that plays itself essentially, but the story, without even talking about the gameplay, the story, I like the story. I like the story. I like the characters. I was interested in looking up like Lassie and false Lassie and like all of the terms they had, you know, and the characters and their backstories and their struggles were very interesting to me. I'm not really attached to Ricardo or Dex or T-Bug or anybody or the main character. I'm not attached, and maybe it's because it's the opening of the game. I mean, I didn't finish Final Fantasy 13 either. I probably got halfway. I liked the story. I liked not even just the story, but the characters and the character development. You know, it was, you know, even just seeing like the characters play off each other. I mean, in this one, there's the main character is, did I say Ricardo? Is that his name? His name is Jackie. Did I say? Anyway, Jackie, like, I'm not really, maybe I'll get attached to him in the future. You know, the story, it's okay. You know, I'm going to pull off a heist or something, but we'll see what happens. This game doesn't have the story to pull you in. The game doesn't have the difficulty to pull you in. You know, it has very problematic AI. Combat can get a little frustrating sometimes. The story doesn't pull you in. The difficulty doesn't pull you in. In some games, yeah, the difficulty is a part of the experience, like Dark Souls or even Ghost Runner for some people. You know, like the difficulty and the fluidity of movement and just overcoming the obstacle. Me playing on very hard, it doesn't have the gameplay, the difficulty, even though it has customization. You're not even going to see your character for 90% of the game. And I don't even think I could be mistaken, but I don't even think there's cutscenes where one just sees their character from a third-person view. What is there? What's the big draw of this game? I mean, it's a competent outside of the bugs. I mean, you can go around, you can shoot people, you know, you can cut people, you can go on missions that are cool, you can do the stealth, you know, and it's like just about every feature that exists in this game has been done better in other games. The only thing that I would give this game, like, I'm thinking about Melee in the back of my mind, because it is true. I mean, obviously there's Shadowrunner, if that's even the correct title of the game, which, if I'm not mistaken, does Melee better and has a more defined fluidity of movement. And heck, there are even games where one plays the game, completely forgot my thought. But yeah, so this game, it doesn't do much. Like, it does everything, it does a lot of things okay. It checks off a lot of the boxes. It's another shooter. It's another decent shooter for the most part. I'm going to keep playing. I'm probably going to finish it. Probably. Maybe it gets better. Maybe not. This is like an hour first impressions. I don't know if anyone's going to watch or finish this video. But that's pretty much it. To reiterate, recap, you know, revitalize one more time. Overall, based on my experience, I'd probably give the game like 7, maybe around that. It does have some things I like in it, especially me being one for Melee. I have to applaud it for doing Melee, which the vast majority of games won't even attempt to do. Ultimately, like an okay game. I wouldn't call it a good game. I would call it an okay game. Again, it does what it does. Think about Call of Duty. People dislike Call of Duty because they essentially release more or less the same game every year. This game is something like that. This game is, I don't even play Call of Duty, but I probably like this game more than Call of Duty. It's very average. It's very okay. It does some unique things. It gives you character creation, but you then don't see your character for most. It's like a troll move. Dude's a troll. The developers are trolls. Like they spend all of their time working on these tiny like mesh, clutter, static clutter, and they didn't spend a lot of time developing the game. And that's going to have to be it for this. It's an hour long, a little over an hour.